Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Actuary Voices, the podcast series from the American Academy of Actuaries. In this series, we feature interviews and conversations around a number of today's top professionalism and public policy topics. Some of the voices you'll hear may be familiar to you, others may be new to you. Today, we'll hear the second of two conversations between Tom Wildsmith, who was president of the Academy in 2016, and our executive director, Mary Downs. Please enjoy this illuminating conversation. Email us at podcast@actuary.org to share your thoughts.
You mentioned having worked for a trade association. I'd like to follow up on that a little bit because I know that we've had conversations in the past about the differences between what a trade association does and what the American Academy of Actuaries does. And you've been very precise about differentiating those two because of your own experience.
I've had to. The experience of working for a trade association has forced me to think about what advocacy is and what it means. It has forced me to be very careful about what hat I'm wearing. At one time, I was a registered federal lobbyist. When I was working at the trade association, I would find myself at times walking into a congressional office to talk to the staffers there about an issue, such as risk adjustment in the Affordable Care Act, representing the trade association. I might find myself a week later walking into the same office with the Academy's health fellow, Corey Uccello, and members of an Academy committee or working group to talk about exactly the same issue, representing the Academy. I had to be very clear on each of those occasions to identify not just who I was, but who I was representing. Trade associations are, by design, intended to represent the interest of their members. There's nothing wrong with that. That's part of our political system, that everyone has an opportunity to petition the government and explain their views and concerns and interests. The Academy doesn't do that, though. We do not represent employers of actuaries, the economic interest of the employers of actuaries. We don't represent the narrow economic interest of our members. The Academy's role is to provide, on behalf of the profession as a whole, serving the U.S. public, the best actuarial advice we possibly can to policymakers. And it's critically important that that advice be neutral and unbiased and apolitical. Two of the biggest problems I've run into working with some of the Academy groups is we have some volunteers who do not understand that the Academy is not another trade association. And I get that. When you're working for an insurance company, you may represent your employer on a trade association such as AHIP or ACLI or any of a dozen trade groups that insurance companies are involved with. Many of those groups have committees, sometimes actuarial committees, that are looking at the same issues as the Academy is. So it's very easy when someone calls you up and says, would you serve on this committee for the Academy, to say, yeah, that sounds like an interesting topic. I'll do that. And not really think through what the differences are. I think we've gotten better over time at orienting our volunteers. And I think most of our more experienced volunteers have a good understanding of what we're trying to accomplish. But when you're serving on an academy group, your orientation really does need to be different than it is when you're representing your employer at a trade association. That doesn't mean that the experiences you've gotten in your work life can't inform the discussion. It should. The Academy works very hard to make sure that we have as many sets of background and experience as possible on our work groups. So we want to have an interplay between actuaries that work for insurance companies, actuaries that work for regulatory agencies, actuaries who are consultants on our work groups, so we have the benefit from as much as experience as possible. But that's different from lobbying to get an answer that is beneficial for your employer, but not perhaps the most unbiased or most objective advice that we can give to Congress.
I wonder what you think the rank and file member who's never been a volunteer at the Academy and doesn't pay as much attention to those kinds of issues that someone like you would have had to as president or VP or being on a work group. Do you think that the profession as a whole, the Academy has almost 20,000 members, understand why it's important and valuable to have that kind of independent and objective voice?
Well, if I'm an example, the answer is probably no, because...
Well, maybe it used to be no, but it's not no anymore, right?
Well, no, seriously, I didn't have an understanding of those issues until I was forced to think about them. And I'm a bit of an absolutist about the need for the Academy to remain objective and independent and nonpartisan. It is amazingly easy to get pigeonholed in a particular political slot. And anyone who's worked in Washington for 5 or 10 years, you can give them a list of organizations and they can go down and put D or R or sometimes L for libertarian or G for green next to each one. And it's very, very easy to pigeonhole these groups. Trade associations try very hard to avoid having that happen to them, but they almost always fail. Because once you start engaging in politics, it becomes a very transactional, confrontational experience. If the Academy ever lets its focus on being unbiased and nonpartisan drop, half the country is going to stop listening to us, roughly. Half the people in Congress will just stop listening to us. And half the people in the federal agencies will stop listening to us. We have been, over the last, certainly as long as I've been involved, back to 95-ish, we have been very, very scrupulous not to identify ourselves with any particular party or movement. And that has gained the Academy a reputation for independence and nonpartisanship that is truly worth its weight in gold. And you simply cannot buy that. What that means is that congressional offices on both sides of the aisle will ask our staff fellows to come in and help them understand important issues in pension funding, in healthcare reform, in life insurance accounting, in property and casualty insurance, federal agencies, in multiple administrations ask for our advice and help. Insurance commissioners from red states and blue states and purple states listen to us. When we go to the NEIC, everybody listens to us and not just half of the commissioners in attendance. And that is, before I came to Washington, I would not have understood how easy it is to lose that. You can lose that in a heartbeat. So on a purely pragmatic level, the one reason it's so important is it means that everybody listens to us. And that's something that very few organizations in DC can say. Also, it does, the discipline, it forces us to think in terms of the public interest and not become just one more voice. I'll go ahead and use the word shilling for insurance companies or shilling for large business or shilling for whatever. And, I think regardless of your political affiliation, most of us would agree that having more people genuinely thinking about the public interest rather than fewer is something that we need.
You put that to good use for the Academy. One of the documents that we have consistently referred to in the last several years is the web of professionalism. Maybe you talk a little bit about how you came to think about that and put that down on paper.
One thing I tried to do as president was find better ways to articulate the Academy's message. I was and am convinced that the Academy is doing the right things in professionalism, in public policy. But actuaries tend not to be great communicators. And I've been fortunate in my work experience to work in an advocacy role where it's been my job to communicate the message of my employer, whether it was the trade association or a client as a consultant or the insurance company I'm working for now, to communicate it as clearly and effectively as possible. One area where I felt a particular need was professionalism. And that came out of my own personal experience. No one ever really explained what was going on with professionalism. As I went through my career, there were instances where I was taught or communicated to about specific pieces of our professionalism infrastructure in a very disjointed, very compliance-oriented way. They came at me in terms of, okay, here are these new qualification rules. Here's this new standard of practice. Here's this disciplinary process. And they came at me, or the way I perceive them, was very much like arbitrary regulations that I just had to check the box. They were hoops to jump through without any explanation of why people in Washington were developing these rules or what they had to do with my life other than I had to comply with them. And it was years later that it started making any kind of sense to me. Now, compliance is important. compliance is absolutely important. But over time, I came to realize that the rules were not arbitrary, that they were not disjointed and disconnected, and that my approach to the rules really should not be I've got to check this box to jump through this hoop to satisfy some arbitrary requirement. And that's why you and I began this discussion about how to communicate what the Academy is doing in professionalism and the way it hangs together. And what I really wanted to convey is how all of the pieces are related and how they are designed to create a framework, an infrastructure, a cradle, support for the profession that's there to help us meet our commitments to our employers, to the public, to regulators, to each other. And the web of professionalism, as you remember, we didn't sit down and write that at one time. It was a process over a period of a year to 18 months of trying to find a way to communicate how all of the professionalism activities of the Academy hang together. And what I believe to be true is that they are a very natural outgrowth of the profession through the Academy trying to meet its ethical commitments. So these are not arbitrary rules. And I want to help people understand what I did not understand, which is that they're not arbitrary, that they're important, and that if we wiped the slate clean and sat down and said, what is it going to take for us to create a framework to make sure that we can serve the public ethically and responsibly, we would end up with something very much like what we have now, because it's necessary.
Well, and I know we have made you travel quite a bit in the last several years. Maybe you'd like to talk a little bit about your international work for us and the perspective that you think the Academy brings to that.
It was quite a surprise as Academy President to learn just how involved the Academy is in international issues. Health insurance is very nation-specific. So doing healthcare work in the U.S. largely means that you don't have to think beyond the U.S. border. My first involvement with international issues with the Academy was when I was president-elect through the North American Actuarial Council and the International Actuarial Association. The Academy actually spends a lot of time and effort and puts a lot of leadership attention into international issues, a surprising amount. I think much more than most of our members would realize. We are unique among the U.S.-based actuarial associations. The other two major U.S.-based actuarial associations are really global educators, the Society of Actuaries and the Casualty Actuarial Society. The Academy, on the other hand, is a national organization. It is the national association for actuaries practicing in the U.S. as our name should make clear. So when we engage with other actuarial associations around the world, the Canadians, the French, the Germans, the Mexicans, we really are peer organizations. So the French Institute is responsible for the standards of practice, the code of conduct, the professional infrastructure for actuaries doing work in France. The same way the Academy is responsible for the professionalism infrastructure in the U.S., or the Canadians are, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries are for actuaries doing work in Canada. So we are actually more similar to these other national associations than we are to the SOA or the CES. They have a fundamentally different role in the profession. When we are working internationally, we are not trying to impose our views on the rest of the world. We are not trying to become more like the rest of the world. We are trying to share what we've learned and learn from these other associations. When supranational organizations, international organizations working on international models for accounting or insurance regulation, when they're doing their work, we're here to represent the U.S. profession's views in their deliberations. We have recently realigned our international efforts. That was the result of 2 years of work from our board of directors. We have, for many years, outsourced much of our international work to the International Actuarial Association. And we were putting a great deal of volunteer time and effort, staff time and effort, travel expenses, a lot of Academy resources into supporting that organization. When the board sat down and looked at what the Academy's international goals were, we found that the board found that they just didn't line up that well with what the IAA was doing. The Academy's mission is to represent the U.S. profession, and that includes representing the U.S. profession in international forums. It doesn't include trying to dictate what the educational criteria for actuaries in Bangladesh should be. It doesn't include making sure that actuaries practicing in Russia, China, and the U.S. have the same code of conduct or the same standards of practice. Personally, I'm skeptical that you could ever have the same standards of practice in China, the U.S., and pick another country, Italy, simply because the economic systems, the regulatory systems, and the markets are fundamentally different. And that's going to have an effect on what actuaries do and how they do it. But whether it's possible or not, that's simply not the mission of the Academy. So the board made what I believe was a well thought out decision, certainly a well deliberated decision, that we would be more effective reaching out to other actuarial associations and to key supranational organizations directly, rather than outsourcing that to the IAA.
Tom, before we finish, what do you think are the challenges you see facing the Academy?
Well, first of all, I think the Academy is stronger than it's been in many years. The Academy went through a number of challenges over the last decade that has forced us to think very carefully about what our purpose, what our mission really are, and what we're trying to accomplish on behalf of our members. And it's forced us to think very carefully about what we're not. It's also forced us to make some difficult governance decisions. We don't need to rehash all of those, but I am convinced that taken together, they have made the Academy a much more independent, more objective, stronger organization. I tend to see, the challenges I tend to see are through the public policy and professionalism lens. Certainly, there are some major public policy challenges facing the country that have actuarial implications or actuarial aspects. Many of these are tied to the aging population. We've got the questions around pension funding and how we're going to pay for people like myself who are getting older over the next, I hope, long time. Some of those challenges spill over into the healthcare system and how we're going to pay for Medicare over a long period of time. So there's some important demographic shifts going on that put strain on a lot of our financial systems. Certainly, we've got the global warming issue before us. All of those are going to involve not just technical actuarial questions, but very real political payoffs, trade-offs. Personally, the way I think about it, my grandmother lived until she was 108. Social Security was a great deal for her. And my parents and myself, we paid Social Security taxes and Medicare taxes, and she was taken care of. I am currently paying for my parents' Social Security and Medicare. I'm pretty sure I'm going to be paying for them. The question becomes whether my children are going to be able to pay for me. And it's really a more subtle question than that. It's I've honestly been more fortunate in my career opportunities and my economic opportunities than they have been. I think that's true for many parents and many children. How much is it fair for me to ask them to pay on my behalf? I don't know, and that's not ultimately a question for me to answer, but it's a question we as a society collectively are going to have to answer. And as the Academy has often counseled Congress to do, we would be better off answering that sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Tom. At the close of 2019 that we're heading towards, it's a pleasure to know that you're still working on behalf of the Academy and the profession, and I look forward to many more years that you will be serving all of us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mary. Working with the Academy and the opportunities and the friendships I've had has been one of the greatest pleasures the profession's given me.
Thank you for listening to Actuary Voices. Subscribe to us on your favorite podcast hosting service and email us at podcast@actuary.org to share your thoughts on this series and topics that you'd like to have explored in the future.